In today's episode, we meet with Jasper, Andrew, and Michael from AvePoint. They are the subject matter experts when it comes to complex data environments. We unpack so many insights in this episode that'll be great for business owners and decision makers, so stay tuned.
AI is it relies on your data. So if your data is all up because you haven't looked at it for 20 years and just been dumping stuff in there, then what's going to happen? It's going to reference all that old data and then give you results back based on stuff that maybe it's not relevant anymore.
Well-known case in the US, so you can look it up on the net and hit the results pretty quickly. But there was a guy that was contracted to do a migration, an M365 migration. Something went sour contractually, and the guy got halfway to getting that customer into Microsoft 365, and well, whatever happened soured the relationship. He went and deleted every single user within the Entra ID.
Archiving. Yes, there is the huge benefit of archiving redundant data to improve the quality of your Copilot output, but there's also the added advantage of saving some money.
Doing work, and you need to know what it's doing, how it's accessing everything, because ultimately the outcome is the business's responsibility.
As a small business, and I was seriously considered about investing in agents and AI, I would first look at my data and be like, okay, is this handle hard the best version of what it could be, or should I put some time and effort into thinking about what that looks like and maybe some governance policies around that before fully investing?
So imagine a junior staff member has given a Copilot license, and we find out that they've surfaced a whole bunch of sensitive information they're not really privy to. That for me doesn't talk about a breach or an issue with the technology per se. It's more about messy permissions. And my view is the data's always been there. AI has just brought it to the surface. So in one sentence, what do you do when that sort of thing arises for a client or an MSP? What would be the one thing or the one conversation you'd have with them when this particular situation arises? I'll start with you, Jasper.
In one sentence?
Yeah, sure, as short as you can, but yeah, 1 second, that's it.
That's a big topic, right?
It is a good topic, and we'll definitely dive into it.
The first thing I would recommend to them is to understand who has access to what those permissions look like. Because ultimately, Copilot AI will function based on the files it has access to. So if you're not reviewing that, then you could potentially have super drives that users access to files they may not have even known they had access to.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else to add?
I mean, I'll jump in. I think, from an MSP's perspective, customers are looking at their managed services provider for guidance to be that guiding light was AI era. And that's a great example of the user with the Copilot stumbling upon some information app. But I think it's important for us to kind of take a step back and explain how we got here, because we look at legacy systems, file servers, all that sort of stuff. It used to be IT that was in charge of permissions. Since this modern workplace era, M365, highly collaborative environments, that's no longer the case, right? I can share a file with you, you might share it with Jasper. Yeah, so I think it's important to paint that picture to kind of articulate how we got here. Like, why are we in this position where somebody can service sensitive information?
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to unpack. Like, it's a huge show. We could talk about hours, to be honest. But I think one thing we want to encourage is people using AI. Like, it's not something to want to vermonder and say, hey, no, they're going to access this sensitive data if they use this. We know that it makes people more productive, and we're just at the tip of the iceberg as to its capabilities, and we don't adopt it, and we're going to pull behind it very, very quickly. But I think we shouldn't jump to assumptions on what is dangerous and what is good. And we need data and insights to help us make those decisions as well. So perhaps let's say we're sharing a data, but perhaps it was a malicious employee as well. And we have to figure out what it is so we can diagnose the issue, and then, what's offered from that.
Yeah. And what do you see, digging into that a little deeper, what do you see is whose responsibility is that? Is that
Microsoft's? Is it the customers? Is it the MSP, the technology provider? Who do you see, or who of those people do you see have a responsibility to address that?
I mean, I'll jump in first, but feel free to add as well. I think the term that we've been using more and more is shared accountability. At the end of the day, everyone's got a role to play in this in the mix when it comes to data security. Microsoft's got to provide a platform, but they've got to provide a platform that works at everybody. So it's not necessarily going to have the niche controls that you need. The MSP is guiding the customer through this journey, but they don't understand the data and stuff, right? Like, you can't go in and say, what should this person have access to? Is this a problem that they have access to that? Okay, wait, only the customer knows that. So the only way forward is for all of us to work together in a shared accountability.
And just for the audience sake, when you say MSP, who is that to the customer?
So an MSP would be their managed services provider, someone that looks after their IT, but also someone that's guiding them through a rapidly changing technology landscape.
I think an interesting question, and keen to hear from your perspective, working more closely with your customers, who within the customer is responsible for AI? Something that we've been trying internally at AvePoint is having different ownerships of many different pockets of teams that use AI.
Yeah.
And what we're learning is that even though we're a pretty unified team in what we do, everyone uses it differently, even within our separate sales teams. And so while it might be championed from maybe a tech perspective, ultimately HR has a big component of it and making sure people adopt it and use it responsibly. And then the individual teams and the leaders of those teams are responsible for the championing it internally as well.
And I agree with that. And I think that talks to a shared responsibility sub framework where you have the IT provider, the MSP, you have stakeholders or decision makers in the business. And I have the same perspective or approach in cybersecurity. It's a cultural thing that everyone needs to get behind together. So there's security protections and controls in place that it's not just an IT issue anymore. It's not the IT guys, responsibility. It is actually the shared responsibility matrix. So talking to that question, it's the same approach with AI. It's about having a conversation about what's allowed to be used in the business from this, when the decision makers, this is like the directors or people in higher senior positions, when they're making decisions around technology, it should be a controlled, vetted approach about what are we all agreeing to use, how are we going to use it, what are our policies and controls around that, and then aligning with a Copilot license for deployment, but ensuring that governance, risk, and compliance has already been addressed. So the responsibility lands with the business in terms of how they want to, what tools they want to use and how they want to use it. It's the MSPs or technology providers' responsibility to help them control that and make sure the data and isn't surfaced in an online way. So their responsibility is pretty much where I see it.
The way I kind of view it is the MSP's job is to give the customer confidence that they can roll this out and be able to go, bananas with it. Right now, it feels like with most customers are a little uneasy because they don't know it. There's a lot of unknowns, and there's no doubt that there's a lot of concerns around it as well. So if an MSP can help give them confidence, maybe set some guardrails, and then employ the shared accountability, then we can encourage people to use it and drive it a lot more internally.
Absolutely.
And I think that shared accountability is so important because ultimately the MSP, the IT company, or the IT lead won't understand the business context of every single department's requirements around how they share data, which is why it's so important that people take some form of responsibility throughout the business and consult with their MSP, their IT lead, so that their ability to collaborate isn't being hampered, but they're collaborating within a framework that has been defined to enable them to collaborate securely and safely.
Yes, that's a really good point. I think, even within SMB, where we might not be talking about large, hundreds of staff organizations, you still have people that will know who should have access to their pocket of data. Like the HR manager might know who should have access to HR documents, but they remember think this idea about accounts receivable or accounts payable. All of that has sensitive information there. So you almost need to empower data owners within the business that it's really in their purview, like I'm the pun, and to like understand what that data is and who should have access to it.
I understand. And, with Shadow AI, when I talk to Shadow AI, it's like, someone spinning up a license with Claude quickly and then getting straight into the business data. That is a conversation that we need to have at a higher level of the business, thanks, and really controlling that. But unfortunately, without those controls from a technology perspective, it is easy enough for someone to go and do that. And I can't blame anyone for wanting to do interesting things with AI in any business. So I can't blame anyone for doing it. You'll have to, 100%. So I think that's great. But what's the risk? And so my view is, from that perspective, what is the risk? We've talked a little bit high level, but what are the certain risks you see, in the industry, in business, where you bring in any sort of AI to shadow AI to without sort of controls in place first, and then governance around commissions and data being surfaced to people.
Yeah, I've got an example I can surface. I'll anonymize, of course, names and whatnot, but there was a customer that we heard about where they had a change of staff in specifically the HR department. So there was an HR manager who created a team in Microsoft Teams, but for HR. But the purpose of that team was to store onboarding procedures. So when new staff came in, that's where they would go to find policies and whatnot, things that didn't contain personally identifiable information. It was just HR policies, procedures, onboarding stuff. Then there was a change of staff. A new HR manager came on board, and he or she decided that they now need a place to store employee contracts, contracts, salary information, etc. Oh, great, there's an HR team. Picked a folder in there, and that's where they stored it. Unfortunately, the controls initially on the onboarding HR team were very lax because it was available to the whole organization. So then you have someone with a Copilot license that can ask a cheeky question like, hey, how much does this guy get paid? In that scenario, that was then possible because the team didn't have the right controls around it for the type of information that was in there. And I think that's really key thing about, avoiding that situation, secure the workspaces for the type of data that's in there.
What's the best way to surface that information so people know what their exposure is before deploying, files into folders, or just being the front foot rather than being a lag measure reacting? How do we know before and have a bit of a radar around those sorts of checks?
Yeah, I think that's key. And I think that's where, the IT provider, the MSP, they can really be that guiding light. There's a number of, technology you can use to do that. But what I would suggest is to start with the highest priority stuff. I've worked with a lot of different customers. There's no such thing as a perfectly secured environment today, right? So what I would look at is very sensitive information, but that alone is not enough because it's okay to have sensitive information in Microsoft 365. But how is that information exposed to that? Yeah. So coupling those things, what's sensitive and how exposed is it? That would be a great starting point for a conversation with an IT provider.
Great.
I was just going to say, perhaps a different perspective on risk as well is actually the ROI of your investment into this AI solutions, right? If you're rolling out, say, Copilot or Claude for GT, there's not cheap. And for a small business, there's a huge investment up front, and you want to be able to get a good return on it. But the secret to AI is it relies on your data. So if your data is old because you haven't looked at it for 20 years and you're just being dumped and stuff in there, then what's going to happen? It's going to reference all that old data and then give you results back based on stuff that maybe is not relevant anymore. And so if I'm in finance or if I'm an employee and I'm trying to use AI to stay up to date and, this is what my employees have been for, and then I'm getting, bad results, I'm going to complain about it. And if I'm a CFO, I'm going to be like, look, we're not getting the results, and hearing negative sentiment from the staff is costing us this much. What do we have it for? And so there's a risk from the security side of it, of course, but there's also a risk from a value perspective.
Absolutely, that's right. So my question then would be, how do we solve that problem where the data that is old, maybe legacy, still important, for compliance and those sorts of things? How do we then manage the data lifecycle piece inside of any business, small or large? So that way AI is only really getting access to, let's call it, the data within the last year or 2, 3 years that's more fresh rather than 7, 8, 9 years old.
Yeah, it's a symptom of something we've been doing with years, even before we moved to cloud, right? We would have a big file server or a NAS or USB drives, and we just chuck everything on there forever. And I think nowadays the spotlight has been put on data and like the importance of data, and no longer can you just pull in everything. You actually need to think about what do we need, what's relevant, what's obsolete, and what's trivial. I think if we're in a regulatory environment where we need a maybe adhere to certain compliance, then we should look at, okay, what do we actually need to keep? Legally, what do we need to keep? What should we keep? And then what's the rest? You know, there's the stuff that we use in the day to day, and then there's stuff that's just like, what even is this stuff? And the good thing is, once you're in the cloud, you can leverage a lot of technology to help with this. You know, we can look at, without getting too technical, some of the age of the files and when they were last accessed. And so understanding, okay, we haven't touched this stuff in years. We haven't modified it in a long, long time as well. Is this something that needs to live in our live environment where AI can leverage it and take advantage of it? Yeah. Or should we look at maybe archiving it or even deleting it?
Yeah, I think it's like there's a change in mindset almost where we used to have a mindset of keep everything forever. That's the safest.
Just in case.
Now it's almost with the other way. Over retention of data is risky. I mean, imagine a data breach, right? The less you have, the more we've exposed, guys. There's a couple examples out there where there was data breaches, and most opinion would let us who read a lot of the information that was there, they actually shouldn't have been going to.
So it's important to answer. There's also a technology cost here, right? So, you know, Microsoft don't give free storage.
That's right.
You know, there's certainly, Jasper, I'll probably push over to you here. There's certainly a better way of doing this. So we're talking about archiving. You know, with the tools that are, you know, at our disposal, especially with your team through AvePoint or any other sort of system that works on archiving. Is there a way to actually save the client a little bit of money, but also be compliant along the way?
Absolutely. When we think about archiving, what we really want to be defining is a long-term strategy with no life cycle. Because what we're finding is that year on year, organizations' rate of creating data is increasing dramatically. And there really is no long-term strategy here. So eventually they hit their SharePoint storage quota, and there could be people listening to this right now that have already exceeded their SharePoint storage quota. And, you know, like you said it earlier, it's not cheap, right? Something like $3.5 grand per terabyte. Which adds up. It adds up a lot. So when we think about archiving, yes, there is the huge benefit of archiving redundant data to improve the quality of your Copilot output. But there's also the added advantage of saving some money. You know, we're increasingly coming into an economy where we are looking at that bottom line and wanting to ensure that we're cutting down on our costs. And if one of your costs is SharePoint and you're storing a lot of redundant, obsolete, or trivial data, then it's time to start thinking about archiving one.
There's also the performance piece, right? Well, what I found is when we start hitting quotas, you start to sort of see a few things slow down a little bit, especially in SharePoint. Especially you got lots of files, long path, maybe things haven't been managed in other ways as well. So for me, what I'm hearing here is like with a compliant, like with a lifecycle management holistic system behind your data, and AI is going to be more accurate when it's only looking at the most relevant data. Is there is obviously some investment or cost saving from a technology perspective because we're using the right systems, the right tools, and not leaning on the traditional original Microsoft as well. There's also that security risk, like how much are we going to keep exposing, Microsoft 365 is the new server mold. We've gone from, and I'll tell you here because we've commonly businesses say, well, we go to the cloud. Well, the cloud is just a server somewhere else. But now we have multiple entry points to that cloud using Microsoft 365 through identity, through APIs, through third-party services. I mean, that's another conversation for another day. But I think what we've all somewhat forgotten over the years with cloud is that, your workspace management or your productivity suite with Microsoft 365 is just the new server, and we do need to treat it like that. The old server needed new storage at times. We had to archive it. Those sorts of things were manual. They cost a lot of money every time, lots of labor involved. But now we're proactive. we can systemize this order and actually save that customer phone.
Yeah, well, I think that's the key part, right? You mentioned lifecycle management, and when I think about archiving or security or anything like that, this isn't a one-off project, and it shouldn't just be something we do every 6 months as well. We should be implementing policies that automatically do this for us. So it's not a lot of work for us to whatever in the rules as to how things should be created, how things should be managed, and then eventually how things should be deleted.
100%. It's a do part of the operations of the business, man.
I've run into so many times where people, when I've asked them, hey, you need to clean up your SharePoint and archive it. It's a absolute mammoth of a task for any internal individual who could be a project engineer or someone who has the skill set to understand the data is tough. They're an expensive resource for a company. They're meant to be productive, and that you've given them a day task or 2 days of time to go through everything, and then move that data somewhere else, right? And then they have to sit there and do that manually, and then they have to have logs, which they're not going to have. They're going to have a whole bunch of oversight and regulatory compliance about what they've done, to understand what's been moved in case something goes missing. There's so much room for error there, but there's also that productivity cost on your internal resource of doing this versus let's have a rule, let's put a system in place, let's put some policies in place and let the system do it for you. But easily we get that data back and put back in place when you need them.
Yeah. And by the way, that's okay. Like, you can just do it yourself and spend days and hours trying to figure it out. Look, people we've been doing for years. So before moving into a cloud, filing cabinets, for example, manually filing things, of putting away and from your kit, and then but we have such great innovation and products now that we should be leveraging these. And if they're not expensive either, and you're going to save money. So it's kind of a win-win situation.
100%. Well, another sort of changing gears a little bit. Some of the times when I was speaking to, clients or new clients or prospective clients, or even just general people about a conception or the misconception of, our data's in the cloud, it's safe, especially the one, we're in Microsoft 365 or we're in G Suite, data's backed up, everything's okay. Where does that sentiment fall down and fall over?
I love you go.
I would say one area would be organizations need to understand how their data is being backed up and the degree of granularity. If there is an instance where they need to restore to a previous backup, are we talking about an entire rollback of their environment? Because if that's the case, you're only really protected in a doomsday scenario. We want to also be protecting individual files, individual workspaces, an individual PowerPoint presentation, right? So when we think about backup, that's, I would say, one of the first things we need to understand. What is it that we're backing up, and to what degree do they have granularity?
I would sort of come back to what is backup, right? Like a production environment isn't a backup, and we don't need to look far to look at the regulators or, let's say the Australian Signals Director around the Essential 8. First line you read is, when it comes to the regular backups, is that all application data, configuration, and the applications themselves should be backed up to a common point in time. That is backed up as in a copy taken from production into an environment in case something that was left actually fine. There's a well-known case in the US. You can look it up on the net and hit the result pretty quickly. But there was a guy that was contracted to do a migration, an M365 migration. Something went sour contractually, and the guy got halfway to getting that customer into Microsoft 365, and whatever happened sour with the relationship, he went and deleted every single user within the Entra ID of that customer. So basically say, you're going to pay me for my work, I'm going to say to my work, go away. With that, crippled the organization, everybody beginning, and it took them a long time to get back online. I think the costs associated were $500,000.
From you saying Entra ID, like, what is that?
Actually, Entra ID, the So my tech self coming up. But Entra ID is basically what manages the identities within Microsoft 365. So Jasper would have an Entra ID account. Yeah, join us.
So if we deleted Jasper's today, what would it be the inbox to Jasper? Oh, obviously, right now, Jasper.
He wouldn't be able to log in since any of his apps that he uses day to day. No email.
For the login of all, right? Logging onto your computer at the end of stuff.
That's great.
As you can tell, we'll show you today. But if someone was to come in and delete everybody's identity, including the administrator, and nobody can get in, lots of different floor on their own.
How do you get that? Like, they'd have to recreate everything, right?
Essentially, yes. I mean, firstly, you'd have to be knocking on, Microsoft's door to prove that you are the rightful owner of this tenant. All of that is time to you. It's kind of like losing your passport. Laying on the net for you. You don't have to prove who you are. And do you still get on with personal experience?
No, I reckon. But that's interesting because, I've run into that at my first years in IT, and one of my first projects, it was on-prem, and I was in the middle of handover to us, to our business in terms of from the previous IT provider who shall not be named. And the view of them was like, we're backing up with tapes and everything's working. And, it went from basically there was no verification checks. Nothing was ever tested. There was no compliance. And lo and behold, something went wrong and they had literally no way to restore. And I remember categorically, it was a company of about 95 users. I believe that restoration process took about 3 days because we had to rebuild not only the identities, the usernames, we had to rebuild email, we had to rebuild every device, logins, connecting to domains. And that would be not too indifferent to what would happen now if there was no real way of backing up, if the things weren't backed up. And then let's say something catastrophically happens to Microsoft, or something happens to the data and we hadn't picked up on it early enough through the retention periods, then we could lose 20 user accounts. No one realized, and all of a sudden we've lost them totally. So having a backup strategy in the cloud outside of Microsoft, it certainly will pay dividends should something we're going. But my question around that is, and we'll talk about retention in a moment, but if we talk about responsibility, who has, like, from Microsoft's view, what's their responsibility and what's the customer's?
Well, something you mentioned earlier was, hey, we'll just put it in the cloud and it'd be safe. And often when people think about that, their head goes to Microsoft's not going to get hacked. And there's a very, very small chance that they will, to be honest. They invest a lot of money into protection of their infrastructure and their data. What we're protecting against, though, is rogue actors that are sending out email phishing, or malicious employees that are, maybe downloading data and exporting it, or more often than not, actually accidental kind of activity where you're accidentally doing something or accidentally sharing something as well. When we think about data protection, we're not just thinking about backup as well these days. Backup's so obviously important, being able to recover from those gem state scenarios, but we should also be thinking about how we're protected against all the different activities that could be happen, such as open sharing of data, or accidentally deleting stuff, or deleting an identity in your Entra ID. This is stuff that happens from humans.
So we throw an AI into the data.
Have you learned the Anthropic one,
Mythos, yeah.
That's scary.
Yeah, well, it is.
Bring with the evaluation, though. Made big song about us about it.
Well, I guess when we're talking about data integrity, obviously structure and everything we rely on day to day in Microsoft 365 is important to every business. We talked about backup being one component, making sure we have that sitting outside the 365. Although we talked about how things could go wrong, it could be third-party malicious access, it could be the end user, it could be an IT provider, going rogue, what they spoke about earlier. Right, so we have the backup, that's great, we can restore it. But then let's talk about AI agents. So AI agents can behave like us in terms of what they can do, depending on how they're programmed or adjusted or sort of set up in terms of how they're grounded in the way they're supposed to execute their work. I'm seeing more and more AI agents being deployed through my customer base, and mainly through 365. And sometimes the customers don't even know they've created an agent, just through how easy it is through a Copilot. What are your thoughts on agent oversight?
because I feel like my view is the agent is doing work and you need to know what it's doing, how it's accessing everything, because it ultimately the outcome is the business's responsibility. You know, oil's all about, hey, our agent's going to, you know, save us and do all that work for us. But ultimately, someone is responsible for the outcome of that agent, whether that's good or bad. And we're seeing both sides of that. We're seeing great outcomes and we're seeing terrible outcomes. What is your thoughts? And I'll start with you, Jasper, about how we have oversight over agents inside of our Microsoft 365 environment.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, as well, for the benefit of the listener, I think it could be worthwhile to actually break down what the difference of an agent is as opposed to an LLM. So I'll open that up to you guys. Yeah, could we break down what is the difference between a agent and an LLM like Copilot Chat or ChatGPT?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So, you know, we're seeing AI, Gen AI initially, evolving very quickly. Agentic would be the new term, and now I go to physical robotic stuff, and it's all very exciting. But these are very quick changes in how AI is evolving, where the first iteration of Gen AI that we saw, and that was Copilot for M365, really a tool that you were able to interact with using natural language. So, you know, the interface would be, hey, Copilot, can you please find this out for me? Copilot's then digging through data and responding to you, also very human language. Really cool. Then it was like, hey, that still relies on the humans to prompt, and they need to learn how to prompt, etc. What if we just wanted something that automated a process in a consistent way in the backend, so we can now create these things called agents, where we will give them instruction on what their jobs are, similar to a staff member, by the way. And they will say, okay, I'm an agent when I receive this bit of information, or when I see this happening, I will automatically do this. And, you know, they can get quite complex, they can be simple, but they're essentially autonomous in what they do, in what they program.
I think the simplest way to think about agents, managing and governing agents, is to think about them as employees. They require onboarding, you know, setting up access, what they should access, what they shouldn't have access to. They require instruction from what to do, what's their job. At some point, they'll be offboarded as well. And as a manager, you should know what they're up to day to day. Where it's becoming increasingly tricky, though, is agents are popping up everywhere, like you said, right? And even within my team, I know that people creating agents are crazy, and I don't know what they do. And so how do we get oversight as to, you know, why an agent exists in the first place, what it's doing, and the life cycle of that? Do we still meet it as well? I think there's also a maybe the business side of me is like, what if the rogue actor was able to create an agent internally? You know, what could that do? And I think that's probably the scary part, because there's a lot of automation behind that. And if our data is not right, can access a lot of things that maybe you shouldn't have access to.
Right.
Yeah. And to go back to your original question, Stephen, around who should be responsible, I think it's a similar point that we made earlier around who should be responsible for secure collaboration with M365. And again, I think it comes down to shared responsibility. If a data owner is creating agents, well, they should primarily have some responsibility as to who or what that has access to. But additionally, we should also be looking at their manager as the IT manager or IT provider. So again, it comes to a point of the shared accountability model will also apply there for control around agents and what they have access to.
Absolutely. And how does one IT provider, internal IT, the organization themselves, how would one, outside of the Microsoft tooling, because they do have some agent management built in, but I also know that your team has ways of supplementing that with, your oversight mechanisms. What are some things you can add in as a value add there for oversight and management of agents?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, the analogy that you brought up around agents not being too dissimilar to staff members. And I think if we just kind of unpack that a little bit and we think about when we onboard a new staff member, they typically have a job description. So there's a document somewhere that says what this person does within the organization. They have a start date. They have a manager, so someone they report to that is, hopefully keeping them on track. Eventually, they might decide to move on, or maybe it's no longer necessary because the business is involved in a different way, and that agent now is redundant, and somebody makes that decision, and of course they then make sure that they no longer have access to that sensitive data. Ideally, they're from revive etc. What we're talking about there is really how we approach governance. So when we talk about who is actually working within our company, as you know, and again, leading into that analogy with humans and business, you know, what agents do we have? That's the first step, is ability. And yes, Microsoft putting some great tooling in terms of agent visibility. However, there are so many pockets, as we've already kind of covered, where agents can sit. Even just in the Copilot ecosystem, you can build an agent from within ShareFly. There's Azure Foundry, there's Copilot Studios, all these different buckets where agents can sit. And there's currently not a tool that shows all of them. And that's what AvePoint's actively working toward, to just getting visibility of all agents. Step one, remember what's the inventory, what's out there. And then step two, what do they do? Who looks after them? Yeah. How long do we need them for? How often should we revisit whether they're still needed? And when they're no longer needed, what's our process to get them out of here? That's how we're always approaching. And for our IT partners who are managing multiple customers and making sure we're creating a system where they can do that at scale. Because you can really get bogged down in the detail if you were, you know, as an IT provider, yeah, customer by customer. So that's what we're trying to do, and empower our partners to be that trust provider.
Yeah. I was just going to say, to round that out as well, when you're thinking about agents, we shouldn't just be thinking about, okay, we need to solve, okay, what agents exist and what do they have access to? If they have access to, really, we need to be thinking more broadly, what is our governance strategy to your point, right? And that may involve data, and you have access to what? It may involve agents, and they involve many things. So I think if I was a small business and I was seriously considering about investing in agents and AI, I would first look at my data and be like, okay, is this hand on heart the best version of what it could be, or should I put some time and effort into thinking about what that looks like, and maybe some governance policies around that before fully investing into it?
Yeah, because agent output, or any AI output, is only as good as the grounded data that's given. It's going to be structured, it's going to be accurate, it's going to be new, or at least relatively new. We talked about that earlier. But it's the old adage of with AI agent oversight, and like anything in business, any technology that we've invested in and applied, you know, you can't improve what you don't measure. And I think with AI oversight, it's super important, because there's obviously risk involved and cost involved, and obviously productivity considerations. That's why we have them. We're not measuring them, we're not watching them. Like, you know, like our team, we're always looking at KPIs. It's no different to an AI agent in my perspective. So to round this off and to lead into closing today's podcast, episode 1, which is great. So thank you for coming in and actually sharing your view of the world of governance, risk, and compliance. But I'll leave you with one question, if we can round it off. If someone just takes one action tomorrow inside of their Microsoft 365 environment, where they've not done any governance, risk, compliance work at all, what would be that first action you would recommend?
I would start by having a little tour through on 365, looking at the workspaces, the areas in which people collaborate, and actually start to review who has access to the files within those workspaces. And that's going to start potentially raising some alarm bells. And if they want to start thinking about implementing AI, well, it's time that they start looking at actually getting some control back in their environment, reviewing those permissions, reviewing that access, and start to think about governance from a proactive perspective as opposed to a reactive perspective. So definitely starting to lean into that mindset shift.
Some themes there. And of course, like that is what you said is like a technical thing. If you're not a technical persona within a business, start asking that question of technical leaders. Start the conversation. Hey, are we sure our sensitive stuff's protected? And then I think before we start talking about controls, let's make sure we've got a solid backup strategy. Because if we're starting to change permissions and all these things, we're all prone to human error. Let's make sure we're protecting. So that would be my one thing. Make sure it's backed up before you start to agree with that.
I think the last thing for me is like, you absolutely must invest in AI. You have to do it.
Yeah.
And if your IC provider isn't talking about AI, I would suggest finding one who is. That's something we have to do.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings a whole bunch of other considerations, which is why we've talked about, you know, compliance today, which is great. Gentlemen, thank you again. I really appreciate your time today. It's been fantastic. Excellent. Thank you very much.